Hello learners, myself Dr. Sudhir Maske. I am assistant professor in Department of Social Work, Delhi University. In this lecture, we are going to understand the community work, its importance in social work, the values, principles and application. As we know that community work or the working with people or working with community is one of the core and important method of social work profession. As we define, community work is a process of engaging communities to address their needs, to promote social change and enhance well-being. And the core idea of this practice or the method is to facilitate collective action and empowerment of the people. As we know that social work is a practice based profession and it has its own value based framework. Also we have certain ethics, code of ethics, and that is how each method has also their own certain values when we work with our clients or the people, and therefore there are also some core values of community work practice we have. The first and most important value of social work is social justice. Another, empowerment and participation. In social work, we always respect for the diversities and try to ensure the inclusion of all people. Human rights and dignity is another important value which we have in a social work, and that's again we utilize in our community work practice. Collective responsibility, another important value we have in a community work practice. Now, how we practice these values when we work directly with the community people? For example, the people from the rural areas, and if they are facing drinking water issues in their community since many years. Now, this issue is very important because the people are not getting a safe drinking water facility in their locality, and once you as a community practitioners or community organizers trying to address these issues, then definitely will try to use the value framework of social justice or empowering people or involving people to ensuring their participation in the process of to resolving these issues. And finally, this cannot be done alone. That is why we as a social worker, as a community work practitioners, try to involve people at each and every stage in the process to address these kind of issues, and that is why these values help us as a guiding principles to work with the people while honoring their dignity, so people can entrust on us and they can also own this entire process, and they also feels that this work is being done by themselves. That is why values are very important in a community work practice. As we understood the importance of values in community work practice, now let us try to understand the principles of community work in a social work. So, the principles of community work, as we can understood as the generalized guiding rules, they also refer to as a rule of right action or a value judgment as to what is sound or good in community work practice. The principles are usually expressions of a value judgments, and moreover the principles are also again shaped and limited by the frame of reference of a community organization. That is why there is a only slight difference between the values and principles. Values are the core strong beliefs. Basis on that, it helps us or it motivates what right directions we have to which directions we have to work with the people. That is how these principles work as a guiding rules, and it helps us in our action. Again, the principles also implies that and help us to become more concerned about the dignity and worth of individuals. People's freedom, choices of options and right to self determination, security, participation are very important while working with the people, all of which help us to lead a more wholesome and abundant life for them and to ensure their well-being. It also implies that these principles are in alignment with such general principles of democracy such as self-reliance, cooperation, partnership, transparency and sustainability. These principles are again also shaped by an understanding of the social forces which interrupt on the individuals and the groups comprising the community. It also involves the planning process and some knowledge of the empirical work in a groups and communities. In the literature on community work, we can find various sets of principles evolved by the different practitioners, social work educators to inform community practice, and these are as follows. The key general principle of community work. First and foremost important principle is participation. Without participation of the people, we cannot effectively practice community work or to address community people's issues. That is why it is very, very important that people's participation at each and every stage we have to ensure in this process. Another important principle is empowerment. So, empowerment is again a process, and many a times we have seen that people feels powerless because due to social structures or the hierarchies or the power dynamics, people exclude from the processes. But when we work with the community people, we always try to ensure that this work is being done for their betterment, and even they are the one of the key owner and the stakeholders of this process. That is why they should feel empowered, and that is how empowerment becomes very important principles in our community work. Third important principle is collective action. The meaning of collective action is that within community there are different groups based on the class, caste, gender, ethnicity, and these groups again we have to ensure that their collective participation into the active processes and the actions we have to ensure. That is why collective action is another important principle we use in our community work practice. Fourth important principle is social justice and advocacy. As we also seen that in a social work, social justice and human rights are the core foundational base of social work profession. The meaning of social justice is that we have to ensure all the sections of the people, they should get equal access, equal opportunities, and if some of them are excluded from these processes, then we as a community work practitioners, we should do advocacy on behalf of them with the government or with the authorities to ensure their dues or to ensure equal benefits for them, and that is how social justice and advocacy become another important principle in our practice. Fifth important principle of sustainability. As we know that community has limited resources, and once the people have limited resources, once upon time if the external agency is working with the people, they completed their projects, later on how these projects will sustain. That is why from the beginning itself, the community work practitioners, we have to identify the available resources and we have to also strengthen those resources, so the people can sustain the interventions which we started. That is why in today's time as well, because there is a huge scarcity of the resources, so that is why sustainability we have to ensure in our interventions or in our work. Another and very important sixth principles, that is the collaborations and partnership. Any work we cannot do alone. Without having collaborations with the multiple stakeholders and having partnerships with the like-minded people, so we can exchange the resources, we can seek expertise, and we can also seek relevant information knowledge from the various stakeholders. Therefore, we must have collaboration and partnerships while working on the larger or macro community level issues. Another important principle is transparency and accountability. What is the meaning of transparency and accountability? As we know that, so every work or any sort of interventions has resource investment, and these resources comes through different taxpayers or the peoples, those who pay taxes, and through these taxes later on government allocate the budgets and it finally becomes the public money. So, if we are utilizing that money for the public good or the well-being, then as a community practitioners, as a social worker, we should duty bound and we should very transparent from the beginning itself, so people can trust on us and they can also own this entire process of community development. That is why transparency and accountability is very, very important principle which guide us, which help us to make this process more trustworthy, or where people can feel that this work is being done for them. Now, we can understand all these 7 principles how we can utilize in our work. For example, if any NGO working on the sustainable farming or alternative livelihood, obviously if the people are facing the issues of livelihood or the they are facing the issues in their agriculture productions, and if they want to increase their productions and if they approach with an NGO, and if that NGO mobilizes fund for this work, then obviously that NGO has to ensure the participation of all stakeholders. That process should be more empowering. They should have the collective actions from all the stakeholders, including the panchayat members, the people from the agriculture department, their staffs. Also, they have to ensure within the farmer community, those who are marginalized, they should have special attention to ensure the social justice with them, and that is how. And we can also have collaborations and partnerships with state government or the other funding agencies and the corporates to address the issue of alternative livelihood or the sustainable farming. That is how we can understand how this principle help us to take initiatives for the community well-being. Now, again we can understand the principles of community work practice in the Indian context. One of the renowned social work educators, Professor H.Y. Siddiqui, in 1997, he outlined 8 principles of community organization, and it helps us community practitioners to address the needs of the people in the Indian context. The first and foremost important principle, as he suggested, the principle of specific objective. The principle of specific objective is very important. It is very difficult to organize the community people as a cohesive unit, particularly in the stages of work. Therefore, to cater the needs of different client group within community, we must have to formulate specific objectified interventions to address those issues. The another important principles, as suggested by H.Y. Siddiqui, that is the principle of people's participation. People's participation is the most important component, as we understood, in a very cooperative ventures. That is why without participation we cannot address or we cannot identify people's needs, and even we cannot make effective interventions, so that issue can be resolved at the grassroots. That is why people's participation is very, very important. Third important principle suggested by H.Y. Siddiqui, that is the principle of intergroup approach. As we know that in a communities there are also some small communities, as described by Robert Redfield in his book The Little Community. And when he defines little community, he was defining with the four important qualities or the distinctiveness: small size, self-sufficiency and homogeneity. But such communities seldom exist in contemporary context. There are, we can describe as communities within communities and overlapping communities. That is why intergroup approach as a principle, it helps us to identify the smaller groups with whom we can make or we can initiate our work, and later we can develop intergroup linkages to achieve the target or the results with the involvement of people at the large scale. The fourth important principles, as suggested by H.Y. Siddiqui, that is the principle of democratic functioning. This principle is based on the belief that there is a tendency among the common people to remain passive and allow others to take the decisions for them. In this process, so people tend to dominate and take control of all the resources and benefits, particularly in the Indian context, where society is hierarchical and it is divided based on the caste in various castes. That is why the community worker therefore has a primary obligation to educate people and to create very appropriate mechanism to facilitate a wider participation to curb the tendency of domination by the privileged minority. And that is how the principle of democratic functioning help us in rotating the leadership at the grassroots in the same direction, and it help us to strengthen the voice of the voiceless. The next principle of flexible organization. When we work with the community, we need to understand, and we work while creating the formal organizational structures at the grassroots, and it becomes very difficult task as people in general, and that is how for the better community well-being, workers need to opt more flexible approach to organization in order to accommodate people with varied abilities to function effectively. That is why they should not have a rigidity while working with the community people, because it is a very dynamic process, and that is why we always need to have a kind of a flexible structures which help us to achieve targeted results or the ultimate aims and objective of our work. Then the next principle of optimum utilization of indigenous resources. It is very, very important principle. We can understand the mostly the India as a developing country or other developing countries, we also call them third world countries, generally having the short of resources, and therefore the governments are unable to provide adequate basic services like housing, drinking water, sanitation, health, etc. Therefore, the community worker or the practitioners largely depend on the mobilization of resources from various sources including the government. So, in this context of the given shortages, we have to the efforts we have to make to mobilize indigenous community people, to mobilize the community resources. The next principle of cultural orientation. In the most third world countries, there are societies or the communities, those who follows various traditions, customs, different cultural practices, and we as a community practitioner, we should regard and recognize those practices, and it becomes very important for the community worker to become oriented to the cultural milieu of the community and to show respect to its customs, traditions, values, etc. That is how this principle of cultural orientation help us and also make us enable to gain the acceptance and respect from the community while working with them. However, this does not imply that the worker should support such customs which may harm the people or detrimental to them. For example, belief in supernatural powers, early marriage, sati. These are the customs which are in the society, and it does not mean that we are respecting those customs. Finally, when we critically look to these customs or the practices followed by the people, it has a larger consequences, but we should become more aware about those practices, and we should also have very critical approach while understanding these issues. Now, finally, we will try to understand the application of these values, principles into our practice. The application means that how we can utilize these values and principles while working with the people. First important step as a community work practitioners, that we have to identify community strengths and challenges through need assessment, surveys, having discussion with various groups or the meetings. For example, when we conduct a need assessment at the community level to address the needs of maternal and child health related issues. So, in this process, what we are doing, we are trying to interact with the target groups, those who face the issues, and in this process we are respecting their age, we are also respecting their cultural context, we are also respecting the geographical context, and even we try to involve ourselves into that social milieu, and that is how we try to understand the needs of our target groups, and to understand through this process we understand their issues. Another important application we can see in the field of capacity building. When we work with the community people, we will always try to empower them through providing training or the resources, or we organize the workshops, leadership development programs, and also we provide the knowledge. For example, training of youth in leadership and entrepreneurship in disadvantaged urban areas. So, when we address these issues, we try to enhance the skills and capacity of the youths, so they can be a self-reliant, they can learn some new skills, even they can start their own entrepreneurships. So, in this process we are utilizing the principle of empowerment, we are utilizing or applying the values and the principle of participation. We are also utilizing and applying the principle of maximum utilization of the resources. So, that is how we apply these principles. Another important application we can understand through community organizing. Whenever and wherever we work with the people, we always try to mobilize the people for the collective goals. For example, we are organizing a community people for a clean up drive or the tree plantation at the common places. So, in this process what we are doing, we are trying to convey the importance of the tree plantations, even we are also trying to convey the importance of cleanliness, and that is how we are making them aware how cleanliness is important for our day to day functioning, how tree plantation can help us to ensure the green environment or the to have clean air in our locality, and that is how we involve people into these processes. The next application of community work again we can understand through the work of advocacy and policy change. So, when we work with the people, we always try to empower these people for their rights, and also to access those rights we try to influence the policies and programs. So, for example, championing for the affordable housing policies in a city with the high rent cost. We have seen that in urban localities many people face the issue of housing, and that is why when we work with them, there are different government schemes, programs for the disadvantaged groups, but these people, due to lack of knowledge or lack of understanding about the availing the schemes and the processes, in this process we try to advocate with the concerned department and we try to ensure the benefit of those schemes to that disadvantaged groups. So, that is how we can understand how we can apply community, how we can apply the advocacy and policy changes in our community work. Again we can apply these values and principles to resolve the community conflict, assisting communities in managing their internal conflicts. Many times we have seen at community level conflict occurs between different groups or the people, those who are in a power and those who are the powerless, or those who have a domination over the resources. For examples, landowners and the laborers. Many times we have seen at many places exploitations happens or it was done through the domination by the landowners. They pay less wages to the laborers or the landless workers. In this context, many times the conflict occurs. So, at that time we as a community work practitioners apply the value of social justice, and we try to ensure the minimum wage as per the laws, people should get it or the laborers should get it, and that is how we try to ensure their equal due or the protection of their rights, and that is how we can apply all these values and principles in our work. Finally, we can sum up these lectures. So, values and principles are very important when we work with the community people. Values such as social justice, dignity, inclusion are the core foundation of social work professions, and therefore, whenever or wherever we will work with the people, we must have the frame of social justice, dignity, inclusion, and we should practice it in our day to day functioning. Again, the principles such as participation, empowerment, collective actions, collaborations, all these principles are the important base of community organizing practice, and we must have to utilize these principles in our work. So, finally, we can conclude that in community work practice, the values, principles we have to apply according to the needs, according to the context, according to the cultural context, geographical context, regional context, and even group wise we have to apply these principles, values in our practice. I hope you understood how values, principles are important in community work and community work practice, and how we can utilize into our work and help us to ensure the larger well-being of the people, and even for the further realization of the social justice and human rights as the core foundation of social work profession. Thank you.